So welcome to the OLLI at SBU lecture series. Today we have Nancy Solomon. She's going excuse me, she's going to be talking about boat building and boat yards of Long Island. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Nancy. Thank you for being here.
I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, well, it's great to be here, and I have so many stories to share with you, and just want to give a shout out to my friends who are here, especially Bob Kent, who's the one that suggested that I come and talk to all of you, and Christine D'Alessandro, and my husband Nick Santora is here, and Gail Riley is also here. So I'm really happy to see some familiar faces and names. So first, a little bit about myself and how this project came to be. Okay. So I'm a folklorist, and a lot of people think, oh, I'm a historian, but I'm not, because I always start with what we can see today and then try to understand where it came from. So I'm sure many of you are familiar, that there have been lots of boat builders and boat yards throughout Long Island's history in various places. I started working in documenting maritime culture back in the 1980s, and that was because I grew up across the street from a boatyard in Mamaroneck, just on the other side of Long Island Sound. And after school, I would go to the yard, and there were still lobstermen and fishermen, working in the Sound. And I was just always really interested in both the designs of the chaps, what they were catching, their boats. Our family had boats, so I was familiar with being around boats, and of course was part of the maintenance crew. And fast forward, after I got my degree in folklore and American studies, there was a job advertised in Freeport to document maritime culture and to do some programs so that other people could learn about the research that I was doing. And one of the first things, of course, that happened is I went out with a fisherman and I saw his boat. It was a Garvey, which is a flat bottom boat, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. And turned out there was a local guy named John Remsen who was building these boats in Freeport. And so I said, okay, I better start recording and getting to know all the boat builders. And in between those 30 years, we started, recognizing that, there were more, pre-made boats out of fiberglass, out of mold, and the designs could have been, done for any boat owner around the country. And I said, I really need for people to learn more about the designs of boats here on Long Island, why they look a little bit the way they do, but most importantly, who the people are and what boat yards are still playing an important role in preserving these traditions. So since we're starting in Stony Brook, okay, let's try and advance the screen. Something happened. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing a second and see why it's not happening.
You're using PowerPoint?
Yes, I am. Okay.
Okay. If you choose slideshow at the lower right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, we've been testing this a lot, so.
Okay. Now
okay, much better. There we go. Okay, good.
There you go.
Okay, so if you were in Stony Brook, you would be very close to the Bayles Boat Yard. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with the Bayles Boat Yard, it's actually part of the Port Jefferson Village Center. And that's that big red building that you see on the harbor. And just a few feet away from there is this little boat shop. And the Bayles Boat Yard has a very long history, because, there used to be, shipbuilding and boat building. It was one of the major centers on Long Island. And like many of the working waterfronts, things changed. And so that building, the Village Center building, was actually one of the original buildings of the Bayles Shipyard. And there were quite a few people that said, we should start doing something so that people remember what this harbor was all about. And so the Long Island Eco Center started this project so that they could help preserve the building trades that were involved, both in the boatyard being built, as well as the types of boats that were typically used, in this harbor. And so the first thing that they did was to build this building that was built by the Timber Frame Guild of New York. And many of the volunteers, help build and shape, the way that building looks. You can kind of get an idea, from these photographs. But then they also decided, well, let's start restoring boats and building boats at the same time. And so most of their projects come about in one of two ways. A boat owner may ask them, to restore their vessel, and that person who would pay, for the materials and maybe a modest fee for their time. And these projects can take anywhere, from, a few weeks to several months, depending upon the condition of the vessel. Now, when I got there, they were rebuilding this beautiful boat. It was part of the Class S boats, for those of you who are really into boat buildings. And they were able to steam the wood, they were able to shape the wood and clamp the wood, and there were people that are always bringing, historic tools, as well as using some more contemporary tools. And so each year they take on usually about 3 or 4 projects, and this is before COVID, of course. And I hear that they're now getting back to something that looks like normal. And one of the first people I met is in the lower right-hand picture, a guy by the name of Bill Kenny, who has since passed away. And Bill Kenny, grew up, working on boats when he was a young man, and, just kind of, kept his hand in that. And he said, it's like with any boat, the restoration of a project can always be longer than actually building a boat from scratch. And you may have heard that, from other people that have been involved in these kinds of projects. And he said, a restoration project, it always involves, surprises. And your basic task is to figure out what the builder was thinking. Why did he fashion it in a particular way? Because even when you have a set of drawings or plans, sometimes they'll encounter an obstacle and they'll have to build a new tool, or it might not be in the plans. So it ends up being a lot of detective work. Now, there are several lumber yards, where the boat builders can find these materials, including Harned's Mill in Comac, as well as Condon Lumber in White Plains. And these 2 yards, you'll hear me mention them because lots of boat builders find that that's where they can find the materials that they're looking for. And they usually, end up, focusing on, anything from, a shallow water skiff or a kayak to a lobster boat or a racing yacht. These are the kinds of, projects that, a lot of people who have these boats don't have very deep pockets to care for them. And so this is one of the resources where, people learn the skills, as well as, the owner gets his boat, in working condition. And so many of the things that they get involved in includes, replacing the rotting ribs that you can sometimes see, on the photograph on the left. They have to replace the planking and, some of the other structural components, including the decking and the keels. And, some of the tools that they use are at least 75 years old, And, this is, one of the reasons that, these traditions continue, is having those tools. And, Bill Kenny, shared with me that says, you really need to bring in a number of skills. And the most important one is being able to read a set of plans. And the other important skill is to measure properly and operate the tools in a way that doesn't abuse the tool and doesn't make the operation unsafe for use. You've probably heard that old phrase, measure twice and cut once. It really applies in boat building. Now, Bill Kenny, like many of the other volunteers, he grew up on the water. He says, our economy and culture was driven by maritime history, up until the last, 40 or 50 years. And, anytime you take on a project that you're not familiar with, they all collaborate, with more experienced, woodworkers in the shop. And it's really just a wonderful way for people to learn from each other. This is what the shipyard used to look like. Okay. And if you have questions, feel free to, put them in the chat box. I can talk and answer your questions at the same time. Okay. Now, the next place that I was directed to was the Knutson Boat Yard in HALE, Huntington. And this yard is really spectacular because you see these buildings. This is what some people estimate as having the largest frame building still in existence on Long Island. It was, it was originally called the Abrams Boat Yard. And before that, it was the Atkinson Wheeler Shipyard, from the mid-19th century. So this goes back to the Civil War. Okay. And Thomas Knutson came here in 1937, and he kept the Abrams name, and as Dan Knutson told me, his original name was Torkel Knutson, and he came from Norway and changed his name at Ellis Island. He came here with nothing, and he was 17 years old in 1900. And he established himself as a man who worked with his hands, and he was a great ship's carpenter. He worked at some of the boatyards in the Bronx and some other shipyards, and eventually he became a supervisor and a yard foreman. Well, it took him almost 20 years to change the name from the Abrams Boatyard to the Knutson Boatyard. Does anybody want to take a guess why it would take so long? And you can unmute yourself.
Maybe attitudes toward the immigrants had changed to be less antagonistic.
Bingo. That's exactly why. He was afraid that people would see this foreign-sounding name, and especially during World War I, when he was really becoming very active. He was scared that they were going to stop buying boats from him, and that the government wouldn't even give him a contract. So that's how that happened. But by the time World War II came around, they were getting lots of contracts, as were other boatyards during this time. And that's because the Navy, the Air Force, and the War Department all needed military boats. The Air Force especially, you may wonder why. Well, why would the Air Force need boats? Well, that's because, airplanes were still relatively new during World War I and early, in the early years of World War II. And so a lot of their planes might end up crashing, they might get shot down, and somebody had to go rescue those crews. So that's why they all needed a lot of these patrol boats. And, because they had, worked, with the government during World War I, they returned and, they were building, large ships there, okay? And, he began building, large ships, and as well as, the familiar patrol boats. Okay? And there were 3 railways at that time, and that made Huntington Harbor one of the busiest ports on the East Coast. Okay. This is what it looked like during the Abrams Yard era. This is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So what do you do after the war's over? Well, Torkel Knutson, turned his efforts to building sailboats. There are more and more people moving to Long Island. They wanted recreational fishing boats and sailboats, especially on the North Shore, where sailing was much easier than on the South Shore. And one of their most popular boats was this boat, the K-35, and later the K-37. And these were not cheap boats. In the 1960s, they sold for $16,000. Okay? But they were very well designed. They had a self-bailing teak cockpits. They had stainless steel rigging, and one of the first sailboats that had an indoor bathroom, commonly called the head. There were 2 burner stoves. There were foam rubber mattresses. And all of these really took off so that, they were selling hundreds of boats. And that eventually caught the attention of the then very young Sonny Fox. Does everybody remember Sonny Fox in that great show, Wonderama?
Yes.
Well, before Wonderama, he had another show that's called Let's Take a Trip. And this was in the mid-1950s, where he would take ostensibly his son and his daughter, but they were fictional son and daughters, but real people. And they would go to different places to learn about what was happening and something that was of interest. And one of their first shows was at the Knutson Boat Yard. Okay. Now, during the same time, a lot of people started experimenting with that very new material called fiberglass. And they said it just made the maintenance so much easier, and it was a lot less expensive to build the boat. All you had to do was mold and have the resin. And so eventually, the boatyard, would begin to decline. Okay. And a lot of the boatyards, I'm just going to go back, a lot of the boatyards, converted to really taking care of people's boats, doing the maintenance work. And, there was still some demand, for boats, but, they didn't need to, employ, 50 people, in order to build those boats. So as a result of that, the yard, really declined, and now it's just a few people that work at the yard. But Dan Knutson is determined to help people who want to keep their wooden boats. And so he works, on the decorative elements as well as the functional elements. And, nowadays, most of their money is made, from their winter storage fees. Okay. They have 38 slips, which they can rent out, but they still have to pay those taxes. And I always have in my dreams that one day New York State will give a big tax break to these boatyards so that they can, hire people, to take care of people's boats again. But in the meantime, Dan Knutson is still plugging away at this. Okay. Now, this next person, Howard Pickerell, you may not know this, but he grew up in Huntington. And he grew up, keeping his boat at Knutson's Boat Yard, and he was a really great clammer. And, he started doing this, when he was just like a kid. And by the time he was 14 years old, he had already built and sold his first boat. And it was, as he told me, it was for a guy named Stubbings, who was an old bayman from Huntington. And he used that boat for 25 years. Okay. And, he was, building boats, he was earning, about, $200, $250 to build the boat. And one of the things that really helped him do this is his grandfather was a carpenter. And, his father, had a basic, 14-foot rowboat. And that came from a New Haven Sharpie that Howard and his father had worked on in order to make it usable. And at the same time, he was, also working as a bayman. He would harvest, 600 to 700 clams at a time. And back then it was, $8 a bushel. And so he decided, that, he was really going to make his living as a bayman, and he went to work on the bay full time. Have to have a little bit of water. Okay. Now, as he was working on the bay, other baymen started to notice his boat. And so he was getting lots of orders, from area baymen, not just in Huntington, but also on the East End. And back on the East End, there were Sharpies and Garvies. And Howard said, he really tried to, get people to embrace the Garvey, which is a flat bottom boat, because it was a lot easier to go into the shallow bay waters. But, people, still insisted on the Sharpies, and he became an expert in building Sharpies. And because the East End, baymen were, there are many more of them than in Huntington, he eventually moved to Watermill in 1979. And that when he decided, okay, I'm just going to build boats, which he could at that time. And, many of his customers are probably names that you've heard over the years, like the Lesters. And he would say, how can he not know the Lesters? There was Richie Lester, Stuart Lester, Stuart Vorpal, who is part of that camp, Billy Schultz, and Brad Lowen. And he said, I kind of blended in. And, you know, for Brad Lowen, he probably made him about 3 boats. And, you know, he said, you know, if you're from East Hampton, you really got to have that Sharpie. But he was able to convince Billy Schultz into, you know, getting to more comfortable using a Garvey. And, you know, he had, you know, fish traps. And so, you know, one of the advantages of having a Garvey is it was a flat deck, you know, with maybe just a little bit of a railing on the side. And so it's a lot easier to get the traps in and out of those boats. Whereas the people who were using the nets, like the pound traps and the hall seiners, they needed something so that they could, you know, bring it over and sort the fish as they were doing that. And that's why Sharpies have that higher side. Okay. And, you know, they're basically, you know, a lot of demand until, of course, things started to change. It became harder to make your living, you know, as a full-time fisherman in the Hamptons, where, you know, the cost of living, it was skyrocketing. And said, you know, today, you know, he started, you know, making things, you know, for recreational fishermen. But he says, I'm basically, you know, taking my traditional work boat and customizing it for them. And so, you know, he might, you know, put in a center console and, you know, put in some seats, because those are the things that people need if they're just going out, you know, for a boat ride for fun. But he says, I know that they're really seaworthy and they're really strong boats. And so, you know, some people, he says, you know, they don't care what they're going at. It could be a Clorox bottle if you want. But, you know, if you live on Long Island, you really need a sturdy, you know, boat. And, you know, he's using a combination of both wood as well as fiberglass, you know, in his boats. Are there any questions, you know, before I keep moving on? Because I'll just keep talking, but I want to give people to ask their questions too.
Let's see. There's no questions except there's a comment. Howard's son, Chris, supervises the Cornell
Cooperative Extension Program.
Chris has worked on numerous habitat restoration projects.
Yes, yes. Chris Pickerell is, was able to learn from his father about the changing ecology of the bay and took that very seriously. And so at the same time, he's been helping people learn how to raise oysters, using ththose cages that some of you probably heard about. And, just trying to educate people about, the heritage, of this industry. And, they're starting a clam seed project, which, may or may not succeed. New York State gave them a lot of money, to help restart the clam industry. And again, it's a complex problem. Yes, Susan. I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I do. I wanted to say that his idea of building strong boats for Long Island is very, very important, because I remember storms come up very fast out on the Sound. And I remember one time Bob and I were out fishing with a friend, and it was a beautiful blue sky, and all of a sudden a really rough storm came up, and we started making for the shore, and that boat was being buffeted around, and we were really scared because it came up so suddenly. And I'm sure that's not unusual for that part of Long Island Sound. So the idea of having a strong boat, you need a boat to withstand an unexpected storm.
Absolutely. I've talked with baymen who have been out of like Oyster Bay Harbor and Huntington, and they'll say sometimes you can see it coming across the Sound and it can take like 5 minutes, and all of a sudden you're in the middle of, a fairly serious storm. It happens on the South Shore as well. There's a bayman that I work with, Chuck Tequila, who was just outside of Moriches Inlet. And all of a sudden there was a major storm that was passing through, and he barely got in the inlet so that he could be safe. Yeah. So, yeah, I can talk a lot about weather and tides and signs of impending storms. But yeah, it really is very important, to have that and to also understand, what your boat is capable of.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I was out in Mauritius Bay with a friend of mine. This is going back quite a few years, but boy, all of a sudden a storm came up there, and I tell you, we were darn lucky to get the boat back onto the trailer. I don't even know how we did it, but it got bad real fast, And,
Yeah.
it-
Well, I'm glad you're both here to share it with us and that you made it back safe and sound.
Yeah.
And these are Howard's boats. So Lady Diane is named after his wife.
There's a question, Nancy, will you discuss the boat builders out east, like Langendal in Greenport?
Yes, I will. Okay. So one of the next projects that I want to talk about is the Ida May project in Oyster Bay. Now, some of you have probably heard about the Flowers Oyster Company, which is one of the historic companies that has helped seed and harvest oysters and clams in Oyster Bay Harbor. And they had originally started with wooden boats, which included the Ida May that was built in the 1920s, and it worked for almost 50, 60 years, and then they finally retired it in the 1980s. And somebody said, that was a really great boat, and maybe we could, rebuild, build a new one using traditional methods, so that we could take school groups out. So the Waterfront Center, assisted by Billy Joel, started this massive project, and it's my understanding, I always have to keep tabs on this, but it might actually be launched this fall. Okay. So, the main person that was involved, that designed this project, came up with all plans, is a wonderful boat builder named David Short, who had worked at the South Street Seaport by way of Maine. He grew up in Maine and, worked, and apprenticed, with some of the boatyards when he was young. And then he brought 2 apprentices with him. And now the project is being directed by Josh. I forgot his last name. I apologize. Another shipwright who's been working with the project for many years. And this particular boat is really a testament to the group's commitment to using traditional materials. And he said, all of us had to learn how to pick out your wood. Well, David Short actually went into the forests of Maine in order to find what type of tree is going to be good for particular kinds of boat. And he said, you have to, scout out the trees for the deck support, and the oak trees that are good for making good keels, as well as pine and spruce, which are good for some of the finishing work. Okay. Many times, it's, you really got to, find, what's going to be durable and also what's going to bend well. Okay. And, he said, a lot of the lumber, had to be cut to size, and because that's used to support, the frame and the keel. And the cutting the wood isn't new, but the way we're using it, they have their own sawmill right there on the property so that they can cut and, really shape it to the way that's needed, in order for this vessel to be, floating and meet the Coast Guard standards. Here you can get an idea of how it's grown over time. The picture on the left is what it looked like when I first saw it. And again, they're building the planking, for the deck. And this was the last time that I saw it, but I understand that the whole deck has now been completed and all the planking, on the bottom has been completed. And it's just, working on, the engine and a few other things. Now down on the South Shore, we have the Toomey Boat Yard, from Amityville. And Bud Toomey was the founder But, he said, my father, from the time I was 2 years old, we always enjoyed boating. And they'd come out to Amityville before I was born, as a summer resident. And in the 1930s, he's about 10 years old. That's when they moved there full time. And, he was about 6 years old when he had his first boat. And he said, I used to, row around in the canals. Okay. Now, in 1954, that's when they bought this particular yard. And they decided that there were so many more people moving to Long Island. They started building rowboats that they would rent out, as well as having a fishing shop, so that, when you came into Amityville on the train, all you literally had to do was walk down the street. You'd be given a fishing rod, your fishing boat, and a motor. But again, some of the times, they couldn't afford to buy a motor, so that they used to actually tow people out to the bay. And Teddy Toomey, who you see in the picture on the left, she would sand the boat bottoms and also do a lot of the bottom painting alongside the yard workers. And she was probably one of the few women that I met that, would be so involved, in this boatyard. Okay. Now, every so often you would get customers that really didn't know too much about boating. And the Toomeys were no exception. It says, one guy came in and said he knew how to run a boat, and Lenny, who was Bud's brother, said, have you ever driven a boat? And he said, yes, I know all about it. And he said, well, you want me to show you a little bit? He said, nope, I know all about it. Well, he gets out, he gets into the boat, and he's going backwards into the canal. And the stern, and the motor were in reverse. And so Lenny ended up having to wait. In America, we turn around and we go bow first. And he was so insistent that he knew everything about boats and that he didn't need any instruction. So after that type of customer, they said anyone who said they rented a boat, we automatically just show them how to use the boat. Now, their sons, Michael and John, were born. They were raised, to basically, take over this yard. And, part of that was, as a kid, you would always go down to the yard. And said, when Michael was very young, we gave him a garvey. And when he was 10 or 11 years old, he could run a 30-foot boat. If we were going out for the weekend, he would take it from Purdy Lane and run it over to the boatyard and have it gassed up for us and ready to go. And, these were, some of the experiences, that they remembered. Okay. And eventually they built, a nice deck, and they have, a really cool tiki bar where you can have lunch, and it's just a wonderful place to go. And, there are people of all generations that, have a particular fondness, for this yard. Now, you have to remember that, when Superstorm Sandy hit, many of these boatyards were totally underwater, and John and Michael both lived across the street from the boatyard. And they just remember, they put everything in the canals, they tied everything up, nothing could save them. So there were boats up and down the street all over the place. And, this was just, one of the things that, boat owners have to do. And one of the things that people don't know is that most boatyards don't have flood insurance, because the cost, it would just be so astronomical. And so, it's just really, you're able to survive, but you really got to have, a plan B on how you're going to get through the next storm. Now, just down the street, from Paul Ketcham. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking again. Are there questions so far before I move on to Paul Ketcham?
No questions right now.
Well, I have a question. How many people have boats in this group? Yay, I know the Steinmans do.
We have a kayak,
We have
two
kayaks.
kayaks.
And Doreen Day, is your hand up, or are you saying that you have a boat?
I'm saying I have a boat.
Oh, nice, nice. So you know what things you have to be prepared for, you know, with the storms and hurricanes. And, you know, one of the other neighborhood places in Amityville is this wonderful man named Paul Ketcham, who I met probably in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You can see in the picture on the left, that picture was taken in the mid 1990s when we really started doing our documentation. And, you know, Paul Ketcham, like other boat builders, always starts with a model, because he says, you know, a lot of times, you know, you would bend a piece of wood around the right thickness, and if it bends around the model, then you know it's going to bend around the boat. And Paul grew up working for his father and his grandfather, and because of that, he was able to inherit many of their tools. But like other people, he had to actually buy the business so that his father and his grandfather, you know, could retire. He says, you know, you didn't just get it, you had to buy it. And, you know, but on the other hand, you got all the old tools, you got all the old frames, and he was all set. So like many other boat builders, a lot of his work had to shift towards maintenance. You know, all the time, you know, the wooden boats would always require a certain amount of maintenance, you know, every few years. And when, you know, things, you know, started to, you know, go towards fiberglass, there was less and less work. So he really tried to stress, you know, for the people who wanted to keep their wooden boats, you know, bring them in every few years. And, you know, some of them, they just didn't care what their boat looked like. But by the time Paul was done with it, it looked like it was brand new. And, you know, that made a difference, because a lot of times he would say, you know, when the boat doesn't look good to them, they don't want to work on it. Now, when Superstorm Sandy came in here, Paul was very knowledgeable about what storms could do. I mean, he did grow up, you know, having, you know, remembered the 1938 hurricane when he was just a small boy. And so he put all of his boats in the canal behind his house. And the thing that you have to know is, you know, you need your permission from the neighbor across the canal to use any, you know, to be able to tie up your boat so that it would stay in the canal. And this way, when the storm surge came through for Sandy, the boat would just kind of go up and down, you know, with that tide. And so most of his boats were just fine. He said, it's always better if you can keep them in the water. But at the same time, water did come into the boat shop, and so all of his tools got totally rusty. And I said to him, well, what are you going to do? Many of these tools are, you know, irreplaceable. They're 100 years old. And he said, well, if you could soak them in WD-40 for anywhere from 2 to 24 hours, and then rinse them in fresh water, they'll be just like new. And I started sharing that, you know, with other boat owners, you know, and they said, that really saved me. Now, just further down in Patchogue, there are actually 2 boatyards. We have Charlie Balsamo, who runs South Bay Boatworks. And, you know, we were told about Charlie from some of our work on the South Shore Estuary, where we were doing a lot of documentation about the waterfront culture, as well as, you know, bungalows and the people who lived there. And this was originally the Bishop Boatyard, and it was built in 1892. And among their projects at that time were building fishing boats for the Doxy Company that was then based in Islip. And they were building, you know, scows and oyster steamers for the Westerbeek Brothers Oyster Company, and dredging steamers for the Vanderburg Oyster Company. And like many places, it was very busy during Prohibition. You know, always getting, you know, boats coming in and out, you know, just, you know, picking up rum offshore and bringing it in, and it would be picked up. Charlie is still working. Unfortunately, that marine railway that you see in the picture on the right, that has been removed and it's now a marina. And it was basically meant that, you know, a lot of wooden boats could no longer be brought into that house where you could work on things, you know, and keep it dry. Everything now has to be worked on while it's in the water. So it's really, you know, slowed him down, and he's also slowing down. He's now 92 years old. And he said, you know, he has a dedicated group, you know, of loyal customers who just say he knows everything. And he says, you know, if, you know, he could always do what needed to be done. And a lot of times, you know, from Charlie's perspective and other boat builders' perspectives, people's perspectives, is they don't want to buy the wooden boats and they don't want to spend any money on it. But most of the wooden boats that, you know, are now built are, you know, come in, you know, from Maine, Virginia, and Maryland that people up here are buying, which is just amazing to me, because we were the boat building capital for so many years. But fortunately, there are men like Charlie who, you know, his customers say he has an unlimited knowledge of both shipbuilding and boat building. And if any of you have ever been on the Lauren Christie that sails out of Bayshore, that's one of Charlie's customers, and they've worked on that boat for many years. Now, just down the creek, literally from Charlie Balsamo, is the Weeks Boat Yard. And how many of you have ever been to Weeks Boat Yard in Patchogue? It's a historic boatyard, so I know some of you may have heard of it or come there.
But there's a question, is Diamure Spanish?
What?
There's a question, is Diamure Spanish?
Yeah, the name of that boat for the previous screen was Diamur. I was wondering if that was a, is Dia God, or is in Spanish, or is that just someone's? I was just.
Well, that's a Spanish phrase for of the sea.
Of the sea.
Yeah, okay. Mare is sea and Dia is day. So it's an interpretation.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So the Weeks Boat Yard came to our attention when we were doing this survey in Patchogue, and Jamie Burchard, who was a graduate student at the time of Cornell, was spending a lot of time in Patchogue, and she said, oh, you really have to go and talk to Kevin Weeks and Brian Weeks. Brian Weeks is the brother on the right, and Kevin Weeks. Brian died a few years after we interviewed him, very, very suddenly. And this is a family operated boatyard. Frank Weeks was born, you know, into a family on Patchogue that had made its home, you know, since the 1700s. Now, he was born in 1883, and he was the son of an officer who served in the Union Army, Lafayette Weeks. And, you know, growing up, both Brian and Kevin, they were just fascinated by all these boats. And, you know, Frank Weeks, you know, was no exception. And he eventually was able to apprentice with a boat builder named Martinez Smith, who owned a shipyard on some of the land that is today part of this yard. And eventually he became a master carpenter and a shipwright. And in 1898, he built and sold his first boat, which was a cat boat, which was a very distinctive Long Island boat, and he named it Onion. And that's because it was said that he paid for all the supplies for the boat by selling onions that he grew behind the house. Now, Kevin Weeks now runs the yard, and there are approximately 11 to 16 people who work there either full or part-time. And they can store over 120 boats. They have 60 dock slips, and, you know, like other boatyards, repair is a key part of their business. And they're also one of the largest producers of ice boats. Not that we would be able to use them these days, but there are other parts of the country where they're still used, especially up in the Great Lakes. And, you know, these boats were designed in 1938, and the Weeks Boat Yard perfected the design and ships them all over the country. Now, like the other boatyards, it still has its marine railways, but it's not connected to the river. Instead, they use these railways to help them get things, from one shop to another. This is the machine shop. And most of these buildings that you see, they're all built on locust posts, which is one of the longest, most durable materials that was used on Long Island for many years. And, this yard has not changed at all. And that includes during Superstorm Sandy. And one of the reasons is because this building here was here in 1938 when the Long Island Express hurricane came. And they saw how high the water came and they moved the machine shop beyond that particular place. And so they knew that if the machine shop was the lowest lying shop, all of the other buildings were going to be safe. Okay. And, they saw so much water here that they said, I've never seen so much water in my life, but everything was safe in Patchogue. And one of the people who also works at Weeks Boat Yard is Chris HALE, who is their primary carpenter and boat builder, but he's also a model maker. And one of the things that he's developed, is making models of all the different types of boats that have been used on Long Island over many years. And Chris, like many people said, I didn't know I could actually make a living as a boat builder. And so he started making them as he worked at Kunkel's Harbor on Shelter Island, at the Hampton Shipyard in East Quogue, and he's been at the Weeks Boat Yard since the 1990s. And he has also followed, a long line of traditions, by working in all these different yards. He says, my great grandfather was a boat builder, and he had these 3.5 models kicking around the beach house, which I liked. He also used to go down to Sag Harbor a lot, and look at the boats on the dock. And eventually we got a rowboat. But I always liked, boats as a kid. I didn't know that you could get a job working on them. And he just thought it was so magical that he was able to, go to Maine and work at, a number of different boatyards there. And then, was able to come back to Long Island and, is now sought out as, one of the masters. This is one of his models, and here he's building a Garvey. And then, I may have to go through this a little bit faster. The Scopinich Boat Yards were one of the other major boatyards on Long Island beside the Knutson Boat Yard. And they also got a lot of different Navy contracts, but their great claim to fame is they were building boats, not just for the Coast Guard, but also for the rum runners. Freeport was one of those perfect places where you had Bill McCoy anchoring his boat just out of Jones Inlet. And there were, people who would, go out there and, either bring them to a bay house, bring them to a hotel, or bring, to a waiting truck, in the middle of the night. And so many of their customers, were these rum runners. There's Fred Scopinich. She's doing really great, at the age of 93. And this is one of the rum runners. And one of their techniques, because they did have a contract to work for the Coast Guard, but they were building the boats for the rum runners using much higher power motors so they could go a whole lot faster. And they also had these engines where they could create a smoke screen so that nobody could follow them. Well, one of the stories that was told to me is one time there was a group of runners going out on one of the boats that the Scopiniches built, and they got stopped by the Coast Guard. Well, when the Coast Guard, boarded their boat, they boarded the Coast Guard boat and took it in order to go pick up the rum and held the Coast Guardsmen on their boat. And when they came back, they said, we're going to let you go. But if you report us, we're going to report you because we hid $500 on your boat. So that was just, one of the many stories that they told me. Now, many of you have probably heard about Steigercraft. Which is probably the last company that will be standing in terms of building boats. And what a lot of people don't know is that Al Steiger began as a clam digger. And he says, you know, I was 11 years old when I started clamming. I was 12 years old when I got my first boat. And both my father and my grandfather, they were both big fishermen. And, you know, when he turned 15, you know, a friend of his, Ron Overton, who worked at the Scopinich Boat Yard, built a Sharpie for Al. And by age 16, he was working on the bay full time. And in the mid 1960s, he decided, hey, you know, I'm really not too happy, you know, with all the hard hours. Maybe I should build boats instead. And he said it used to cost about, you know, $200 or $300 to build the boat, maybe $400 if you wanted a motor with it. And then you would buy a clam rake and baskets and all the other things. And so for that $1,000, you were a full-time clammer. So those became his customers, all the guys that he was, you know, working with. Now, his first boats were actually wooden boats, and they were very similar to the ones that Howard Pickerell built. But it was very labor intensive and time consuming, as people would tell you. And so in 1974, he began building fiberglass boats, but he didn't shift full, you know, to a full fiberglass frame until 1990 with another boat builder by the name of Eric Wright. And they had what's called a wood stringer system, so that the mold actually looks like a ribbed boat, very similar to what, you know, we've seen, you know, in other pictures. And it would have a wood floor and a wood deck. And, you know, then, you know, they said, well, eventually, you know, we decided to just get rid of the wood stringers and, you know, make everything out of fiberglass. And so from that, he's built an empire. You know, it's one of the most popular boats on Long Island, but they're basically a dressed up clam boat, you know, because he was on the South Shore and most of his customers, and they're, because of all the shallow bay inlets, this was the boat that people wanted. So he's really stuck to the traditional design using, you know, very modern materials. And he said, you know, we designed these boats to last forever because that's what I believe in. And that brings us back to Al Grover, who is one of the people who used that very similar design to the Steigercraft boats, but he wanted a boat that could actually make it across the Atlantic Ocean so he could establish the Guinness Book of World Records for an outboard motor trip. And, you know, Al Grover grew up in Baldwin and Freeport, and he used to just pick up whatever boats happened to be lying in a creek that people had abandoned. He'd fix them up and then eventually, you know, either sell them or take it for himself. And so one of the things that happened is in the early 1970s, and I'm sure some of you might remember this, when we had that gas crisis and gas prices were through the roof, similar to what they are now. Well, people wanted something that they could take out on the water that wasn't a gas guzzler. And so his boat really took off. He remembers going to the New York Boat Show and just, you know, all of a sudden he had a long line of customers and more orders, you know, kept piling in. So in order to promote himself, you know, in the business, he decided to make this transatlantic journey. And that's when he, you know, started up in Newfoundland. He almost didn't make it because he had some boat trouble, and his son, who he drafted to go with him, said, I'm not going on this, and that's going to be a problem. So he called his wife and said, well, we're not going to go. And she said, over my dead body, you've been planning this for many years, and you need to do this trip. So his other son, Dante, came up with him, and they started that journey with Al Jr. And then Dante arrived. And so eventually they did establish that Guinness Book of World Records, but they also, you know, continued to make these boats for many years until, you know, again, there's been a decline. Now, I know somebody wanted to know if I was going to talk about some of the East End folks, and I didn't include it in this presentation. I guess I thought because Stony Brook is more in the middle of the island that you might be interested in more of the things that are kind of around there. But the Half Boatyard is like one of my favorite places. That's in Greenport on Sterling Place, and it's also where Wooden Boatworks got their start. And so Don Costanza grew up in Sayville, and he started apprenticing in Europe after a friend of his decided to go to Europe and learn about, some of the traditional Italian and European ways of building boats. And then he came back. He had, worked with Al Terry of West Sayville, where he grew up, restoring lots of beetle cats, as well as the Gill Smith boats. And so when the Half Boatyard was up for sale, one of the things that the new owner, John Costello, decided to do is, he wanted to keep it as a working boatyard, but he also gave space to Don Costanza and Wooden Boatworks. And so they started restoring yachts. They also started building traditional racing yachts for many of the people out there. So that's just another, part of, this documentation project, but it's also part of my book. So I'm not going to, push it, but if anybody's interested in learning more about these stories, I do have a book out, and you can get it through Arcadia Publishing or through Long Island Traditions. And we're also have these cell phone tours where you can actually go to Half Boatyard and learn about Wooden Boatworks and some of the other boat builders. We've got the Bayles shop on a cell phone tour that's coming out now. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Okay,
And
Susan has a question.
Yes, I do. We live in Mastic Beach on the South Shore, and I wondered, I know that there are a lot of marinas that are quite old in Mastic Beach, but I'm wondering if there were any boat builders or boat yards in Mastic Beach.
one of the limitations is you can't do everything, but I'm not familiar with any particularly historic boatyards in that neck of the woods. I want to say that in Brookhaven Hamlet, there's the Taylor Boatyard, and there's also the Carmen's Maritime Center. And those have, provided a resource, for people that own historic boats.
And Mimi has her hand up.
Yes, yes.
I actually have a question and a comment. I'll start with the comment. Back in the day before COVID, the Long Island Maritime Museum used to have a boat festival where boat builders would come in and they'd have some of their boats, boat restorers. And it was a wonderful experience and a wonderful opportunity to get to meet the people who were doing this work. My boat happens to be a 15-foot Eastern mahogany lapstrake. It's just, there's nothing like it. Let me just say that. And Anders Langendahl restored it, which is why I was curious whether you were going to talk about that. My question is, does your book cover the recreational aspect of the little sea skiffs that we had? I'm not talking about kayaks. I'm talking about back in the day, we used to water ski on the Long Island Sound and in the bays. And that was a big business back then. So I don't know if you talk about that at all.
Well, again, a lot of boatyards do a variety of things. So in my book, there are some elements of some chapters, especially like Anders Langendahl, who's worked on a lot of boats. We have a chapter about him and Don Costanza. They've worked on beetle cats. As well as, Al Grover, who's building, these very small, modest skiffs. John Remsen, who built many of the Garveys, in and around.
The name of the person, there's a person, or used to be, on Shelter Island that collected cats.
Cockles Harbor, which is in the book,
It was
Peter,
near Cockles
the Peter
Harbor.
Needham family.
Yes.
His father started that boatyard in the 1950s, and they were living in Glen Cove, and literally his father said, I want to run a boatyard. What do you guys think? And that's how they got started. And they built, like Julie Billy Joel's boat, the Alexa. So they're in there, and we also wrote a little bit about how the marina has changed, because again, it went from commercial to recreational boating.
Well, thank you very much for doing this, because I think that we've lost sight of boating on Long Island, except the large boats, the little sea skiffs and the types of things that they had out at Shelter Island in Greenport. We've forgotten about that. So thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mimi.
And Lily has her hand up.
Okay. Lily?
Thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
I had the pleasure of sailing on the Priscilla from the Long Island Maritime Museum. I've done that a couple of times, and that's really impressive. That oyster boat, that was just really lovely.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful boat. I think it was declared a National Historic Landmark, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yes,
Mike Caldwell put in many hours, for that, and Don Costanza worked on that as well. So yes, it's just a prime example that if you have the passion, there's so many great things you can do.
yeah, but a lot of people you can sail the Priscilla, and as a tourist, that it takes so many people. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, Jane has a question. Jane, you want to?
Yeah, it's really very interesting. I took a boating course in the high school, and it was so frightening. They told us all the terrible things that could happen. I think I never went on a boat again, certainly. But I wonder, are there young people going into this field, or is it going to pass away with the people that are in the field already?
Well, it depends on the family. A lot of the third generation now, are interested in continuing, to work on boats and to, helping people with their boats. But not as many. So it is one of the reasons we did the book, and also to help save our waterfront, landscapes. How many condos do we really need on the waterfront? Don't
get me started.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons, I wrote the book and did the exhibit, that we did 10 years ago.
Nancy, tell us about your Bay House tours.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the other books that I wrote is about the bay houses that are on the South Shore, mostly in the town of Hempstead, but there's also a group of bay houses in the town of Islip. But every year we take people out to look at the bay houses. Some of you may have seen there was a movie on PBS, and we also have the movie on DVD about the bay houses. And so we go and take people out, to look at them and to meet some of the owners. There was a time where one of the town supervisors in the town of Islip, I want to say McGowan, thought, oh, well, we could rent these houses and people could have a weekend and, we could make a lot of money. And so they hired a consultant to look into this, who came on one of my Bay House tours and then learned firsthand what was involved in first just getting to a bay house and taking care of it, and said by the end of it, I don't think that we should ever get rid of those bay house owners. They're the only ones who know how to take care of them. But they're part of rum running, they're part of the fishing heritage and duck hunting, and so there's a lot of history connected to the bay houses. And you can buy the book, you can buy the DVD, but you can also right now WLIW is showing the movie free on their online platform, and occasionally I think they broadcast it as on some of their regular programs like Treasures of New York.
The actual tours, they go out in a boat and you can
you meet the owners of 2 bay houses as part of the tour.
Okay, I'm gonna put that in your, in the chat here if anybody.
I'll warn you ahead of time, they fill up very quickly because we can only go out in small boats.
I only found one for June, so.
Yes, the calendar doesn't allow us to post things in July quite yet.
Is that the first one coming up in June?
Yes.
Okay. And I will share your website so that anybody has any questions, they can reach you.
Where do they go out of?
One tour goes out of Long Beach and one tour goes out of Freeport. It's a big bay, so we try and focus, so it doesn't become an all day thing and we get stuck at low tide.
There's a comment from Steve. Over the pre-World War II decades, my grandfather owned several in the Freeport area. Steve, are you on? I don't know if he's on.
Oh.
Yes, I am. He
Oh,
was a licensed plumber, but his passion was clamming and fishing and just hanging out in the bay with his friends. And my guess is he owned bay houses from the 30s through the 50s when they finally got too much for him to maintain, and he sold one to the Freeport, or gave it to the Freeport Fire Department.
oh, I know that bay house.
these-
It's still
Yeah,
standing.
Yes, it was one of the few that survived the mania of the 60s and 70s, where environmentalist ecologists were saying, oh, we got to take them down, they're ruining the bay, and fortunately a few did survive, and you've archived them, and congratulations to you for doing that.
Yeah. That's a whole other program, which I don't know if we have enough time, but basically they were going to get rid of all of them until I kind of showed up and said, well, you have to document them, otherwise you're violating federal law. By the time I was done documenting, they said, well, maybe we should keep them. And I said, that would be a good idea.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing that.
Are there any other questions from anybody before we sign off? No? Okay. Well, Nancy, this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed it.
Very
And
much.
I do
Thank
have
you.
some book signing programs coming up if you want to meet in person and get a copy. There's a whole bunch of stuff on our website.
Yeah, I'll be in touch regarding some of your programs that the OLLI members might be interested in. There's some trips, there's different things. So we'll definitely be in touch. But again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate all that you shared with us today.
Great program. Thank
Yeah,
you.
very good.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Nancy.
you.
Karen, I'm hoping to see you on one of the bay tours.